Welcome to Heartbreak Chronicles. He's a violent monster. Clarice cried to the judge, her well-groomed face streaked with just the right amount of tears, her voice trembling with fear. I live in fear every day, Your Honor. I'm afraid he'll hurt me. In the sparse gallery of the courtroom, a few of her invited friends let out sympathetic sobs at appropriate intervals. Clarice's attorney, a greasy-haired man named Sloan, immediately hands over a tissue and glares hard at the man in the dock with a morally condemning gaze. That man is Arthur. Arthur didn't say a word. He wore a dark, gray-tailored suit, meticulously ironed, an outfit that made him look more like a serious academic than the violent monster Clarice had described him as. He just sat there quietly, as if the farce playing out in the courtroom had nothing to do with him. To all who knew him, he was Arthur, a top-notch forensic accountant and partner in a leading Chicago auditing firm. His world consists of numbers, accounts, and tracking down the truth hidden behind complex transactions. He was accustomed to observing in silence, searching for that one fatal break in the flurry of data. His silence, in the eyes of Sloane's lawyers, is hard evidence of acquiescence to the crime. Your Honor, Sloane raised his voice and stated passionately, my client, a brilliant, independent interior designer, has endured a long history of emotional abuse and threats of violence from Mr. Lombardi. His controlling and paranoid behavior has seriously affected my client's normal life and work. We ask the court, for her protection, to grant this writ of habeas corpus immediately. Arthur's lawyer, an able middle-aged woman named Eleanor, was about to rise and refute this nonsense with legalese and facts, but Arthur gently raised his hand and stopped her with a look. He hadn't looked at Clarice since, those deep, seemingly all-seeing eyes just gazing calmly at the judge in front of him, a Judge Friedman known for his irony and aversion to courtroom theatrics. Then Arthur made a move that took everyone by surprise. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't even show any anger or aggression. He simply removed a thick, fire-painted, craft envelope from his plain-looking leather briefcase. There was no writing on the envelope, only a strange, intricate insignia branded with scales and keys. He handed the envelope to Eleanor, the attorney beside him. There was a flash of surprise in Eleanor's eyes, but she took it and, as Arthur had previously instructed, presented it to the clerk of the court, who then solemnly forwarded it to Judge Friedman. The judge frowned, clearly displeased with this unorthodox way of presenting the case. He picked up a delicate paper cutter and, with slight impatience, slashed through the thick layer of fire paint marks and drew out the papers inside. The very moment the judge's eyes swept over the first page of the document, the displeasure and majesty of his face disappeared. In its place, there was an incredible shock, as if he had seen something that was enough to overturn his entire professional perception. His lips parted slightly, his breathing became rapid, and his face turned pale at a rate visible to the naked eye. He flipped through the stack of papers quickly, each page making his hands shake a minute more, his eyes shifting from shock to anger and back again to an icy, chilling seriousness. There was dead silence in the courtroom as everyone was stunned and overwhelmed by this sudden and dramatic change in the judge. Clarice's sobs also stopped awkwardly as she looked at the judge in confusion, not understanding what could be in an envelope that could have caused the judge, who had seen it all, to lose his temper to such an extent. Finally, Judge Friedman jerked his head up, but instead of turning his gaze to Arthur, his gaze was pinned dead on Clarice like a sword hardened with ice. There was no longer the slightest hint of sympathy or scrutiny in those eyes, only cold, undisguised anger and a hint of disgust. Bailiff, he roared with all his strength, his voice echoing in the solemn courtroom, shaking everyone to their core. Two tall bailiffs immediately stepped forward, confusion on their faces as well. Arrest this woman immediately. The judge pointed at Clarice, his voice hoarse with anger, every word thrown out. Clarice was utterly confused. The sadness on her face momentarily solidified and turned to horror and disbelief. What? Your Honor, what are you talking about? I'm a victim. You can't. The judge ignored her protests as he slammed his gavel, the heavy thud seeming to be the final verdict on the lie. He yelled down at a stunned Clarice. Ma'am, do you have any idea who your ex-husband really is or not? He raised the papers in his hand, which seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. You are suspected of perjury, malicious prosecution, conspiracy to commit commercial fraud, and money laundering. The FBI agents out there would love to know where you hid that second set of ledgers documenting all the illicit financial transactions with Damian Vance. Commercial fraud, money laundering, the FBI. These words hit Clarice like a bolt from the blue, one after the other. The blood on her face instantly faded, and her body trembled uncontrollably. She looked in horror at Arthur, the man she'd been married to for 8 years and thought she'd long since seen and even somewhat despised. At this moment, he was still expressionless, but in the depths of those calm eyes, it was as if there was a bottomless cold pool that was coldly reflecting how her carefully planned drama had collapsed into a mess in an instant. After 8 years of marriage, Arthur and Clarice had been an enviable couple in Chicago's circle of family and friends. Arthur was a top forensic accountant in the industry, a boring job but a steady and lucrative income that provided them with a nice townhouse and a decent living in an affluent North Shore neighborhood. Clarice, on the other hand, runs a high-end interior design studio and is beautiful, classy, and a star of the social scene. Arthur's stoic introspection aptly complements Clarice's vivacious flair. He's the main man on the inside, providing a solid financial foundation. She's the main man on the outside, responsible for maintaining a glamorous social life. It's a seemingly perfect balance. Arthur used to think that was the piece he wanted, too. He admires Clarice's talent and is willing to support her career. He quietly pays the high rent for her studio, buys her the latest design software, and never complains about her inspirational purchases that often go over budget. He thought that he could get a warm home in return for what he had given. However, for a top forensic accountant, the numbers don't lie. Anomalies are always the first to appear in the accounts. About a year and a half ago, Arthur began to notice small, illogical financial signals. Their joint credit card statements began to show up frequently with purchases he wasn't familiar with. The bill from an upscale hotel bar called Elysian Fields appears 2 to 3 times a week, with small purchases, but on weekday afternoons. There are also purchases of luxury brands, which Clarice explains as for the studio's important clients. But the frequency and the amount of money are more than her studio's meager profits can support. Arthur didn't vocalize it. For him, suspicion must be backed up by evidence. He didn't bother questioning Clarice. That would only lead to pointless arguments and more lies. He chose to start a silent audit of his marriage in the best way he could. He created an encrypted e-file as if it were a complex corporate fraud case. He pulled all bank runs, credit card statements, investment records, and tax documents for the past 3 years. He used specialized software to cross-reference and pattern analyze these data. Soon a name surfaced, Damian Vance. Damian is a hotshot real estate developer in Chicago, known for his aggressive tactics and extravagant style. Clarice had recently taken on the job of designing a model room for a luxury condominium project under his name, which she had been excited about, calling it a turning point in her career. Arthur found that all of the purchases at the Elysian Fields matched Damian's long history of suites at the hotel. Those luxury purchases were also often made after Clarice claimed to have gone to see Damian to discuss the design of. To add to his chills, he discovers that $50,000 has been transferred from their joint savings account through a series of complicated transfers to Clarice's studio account, which she used to pay for the entire cost of attending a Damian-sponsored top designer summit in Lake Como, Italy. Her line to Arthur was that the trip was fully sponsored by the organizers. Lies, one after another. Arthur's insides felt like they were gripped by an icy hand, but his face remained motionless. He knows that while marital infidelity is sickening, it is often the deeper motives behind the betrayal that are truly deadly. He needed to know if this was a mere emotional betrayal or a plot against him. He hired an extremely low-key and expensive private investigator, a former federal agent he only contacted through an encrypted channel. The instructions he gave were simple. Don't alert the target. Just document all offline contacts between Clarice and Damian and gather information on their public business activities. A week later, the first batch of information arrived on Arthur's encrypted server. The photos show Clarice and Damian kissing intimately on a hotel terrace and looking affectionately at each other in a fancy restaurant. But it wasn't these expected images that made Arthur's pupils plummet. It was a preliminary analysis of Damien's finances. The report shows that Damien's company, Vance Properties, on the surface, is actually saddled with a huge amount of short-term debt and a precarious financial chain. He desperately needed a large, clean bridge fund to launch his next and fateful project, the Pearl on the Lake. Clarice, or rather Arthur behind Clarice, seems to be what he sees as dry net money. Over the next few weeks, more information came together. By analyzing Damien's public financial reports and contractor records, Arthur found that he was suspected of using inferior materials and misrepresenting costs on several projects. And Clarice's design studio, too, is starting to get confused in its accounts. She seems to have learned under Damien's tutelage how to use the studio to falsify her accounts and package her personal expenses as business expenses to avoid taxes and hide her true expenses from Arthur. The most damning evidence came from a vague conversation recorded by a private investigator in a public place. It was in the outdoor smoking area of a charity dinner, and Clarice and Damien thought no one was around. "Are you sure Arthur will agree to tap into their joint investment account?" It's Damien's voice. "He will," Clarice said with a hint of impatience and conceit in her voice. "He trusts me. And he's just a boring accountant with nothing but numbers in his head. As soon as I tell him it's a short-term real estate investment with a 30% return, his petty civic greed will get him to sign on the dotted line. He dreams of proving that he knows how to invest in addition to doing the books." "Very well," Damien laughed softly. "As soon as the Lakeside Pearl project gets off the ground and we get a long-term loan from the bank, we'll pay him back his principal along with the profits. And then, honey, you can divorce him and never have to put up with that tedious man again. My entire empire will have a piece of you." "That's more like it." Clarice's voice was full of yearning. Arthur closed the recording file with a grimace. The room was dead silent, with only the slight hum of the server fan. There was no monstrous anger in his chest, only a chill that went deep into his bones. Turns out, in Clarice's eyes, he's not only an uninteresting husband, but a tool that can be easily manipulated, drained of value, and then discarded. Not only did they betray his feelings, but they also set up an elaborate trap, trying to empty him of his entire fortune in order to pave the way for their bright future. At that moment, something in Arthur's heart that had been suppressed by reason and warmth awoke completely. He's not a numbers-only accountant. He's a forensic accountant. It is his job to ferret out the truth from the most complicated lies and disguises, and then make those who think they are smart pay their fair share in the face of cold evidence. He began to formulate a plan not to save the marriage, but to completely liquidate it. This audit is no longer about cold accounts, but about two living, self-righteous betrayers. And the final report of the audit will be written with their destruction. Arthur's plan for revenge was as sophisticated, complex, and multi-staged as any major financial fraud case he had ever handled. He named it Final Audit. The first thing he had to do was protect himself. He consulted with a top trust attorney at another law firm for consideration of a long-term trust investment. On the advice of his attorney, he legally transferred most of their joint assets, over time, into a newly created irrevocable trust that was highly protected by the law. The beneficiaries of this trust are his elderly parents, and Clarice, as a spouse, is skillfully excluded from the legal documents. The whole process was legal, and Clarice even signed a couple of documents she couldn't understand, thinking it was just another one of Arthur's boring financial planning exercises. Over the next 2 months, Arthur was like a lurking hunter, using all his expertise and contacts to quietly gather incriminating evidence against Damien and Clarice. He no longer relies on private investigators because he knows that the most conclusive evidence is often hidden behind publicly available information and figures. He obtained building permits, lists of material suppliers, and subcontractor contracts for all of Damien's completed projects through legitimate sources. He then anonymously contacted several small contractors who had had problems with Damien and were upset about being owed money. He did not promise any favors, but merely asked Vance Properties some professional questions about project costs and material specifications as an analyst who was conducting investment due diligence on. Small business owners who have been squeezed for a long time are happy to complain to this professional-looking analyst. They provided extensive inside information on how Damien cut corners, used non-compliant materials, and falsified acceptance reports. Arthur compared this information with official documents one by one to build a complete chain of evidence. At the same time, he conducted a remote audit of Clarice's studio. He discovered that Clarice, at Damien's behest, had set up a separate shell company to perform design consulting work for Vance Properties. This company shares resources with the studio, but the accounts are completely separate. By paying Clarice design fees at well above market rates through this shell company, Damien was in fact laundering the money he had embezzled from the project into Clarice's legitimate income. Clarice, in turn, uses the money to maintain her lavish lifestyle and brags to Arthur about her career success. In order to get the most crucial piece of evidence, the second set of ledgers that records all the illegal money transactions, Arthur sets up an elaborate trap. He knew Clarice had been trying to replace the old Apple all-in-one in the studio. One weekend, he accidentally spilled a cup of coffee on his computer. After Clarice complained and urged him to do so, he very kindly bought her a brand new, top-of-the-line computer the next day. While helping her set up the new computer and kindly migrating the data from the old one, Arthur installed a tiny, virtually undetectable data recovery and monitoring program on the old computer's hard drive when Clarice wasn't looking. The program can remotely wake up and access the old, obsolete computer when he needs it. He knew that, given Clarice's personality, she would never destroy the all-important electronic ledger so easily, but she wouldn't be stupid enough to keep it on her new computer either. The safest place to be was this old computer that she thought had been scrapped and was about to be disposed of. With all the key evidence in hand, Arthur begins the second step of his plan. He would have to demolish it like a dangerous building, first cutting through the load-bearing walls with such precision that it would begin to crumble from the inside. He sent an anonymous report to the City of Chicago's Building Safety Inspectorate. The report does not provide all of his evidence, but only reveals precise details about the substandard materials used for fire system piping in Damien's latest project, the Pearl on the Lake, and even includes photos of the supplier's batch numbers and forged certificates of compliance. This information was too precise for the IG to ignore. A week later, a raiding team seized the site of the Lakeside Pearl. The project was called off indefinitely, and a full safety overhaul was required. This one completely disrupts Damien's plans. The project shutdown meant he couldn't get a follow-on loan from the bank, while the loan sharks he had previously borrowed from were accruing staggering interest on a daily basis. His money chain, instantly strained to the limit. A panicked Damien begins frantically pressuring Clarice to convince Arthur to invest the life-saving money immediately. "You have to get him to sign today." Damien's voice on the phone was grumpy and desperate, "or we're all screwed." Clarice is also feeling a great deal of pressure. She mentioned the lucrative investment program to Arthur several times, but Arthur was uncharacteristically hesitant and cautious. "Honey, it's just too risky with the unstable market and the sudden shutdown of Damien's project." Arthur advised her with a sincere look on his face. "Let's just wait and see. With our money, safety comes first." Arthur's sanity makes Clarice furious. In her opinion, the man was not only uninteresting, but cowardly and devoid of vigor. She begins to argue frequently with Arthur, accusing him of not knowing how to invest, not having a vision, and being on the verge of missing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The atmosphere in the house became saber-rattling. And that, in a nutshell, is what Arthur wants. He's going to pique Clarice's anxiety and desperation and make her act even more irrationally. After a heated argument, Clarice slammed the door. She didn't go home that night. Arthur knows that she went to Damien's. He sat in the darkened den and remotely activated the surveillance program on the old computer. He easily bypassed the simple boot password and found the encrypted file named Private Accounts in the hidden partition of the computer. He didn't copy it or delete it. He just quietly looked at the rows and rows of numbers that recorded greed and sin, and then, like a most patient hunter, waited for the best time to close the net. That time, he knew, was coming soon. Clarice's patience has run out, and she and Damien are desperate. They will make their last and stupidest move. Sure enough, a few days later, a letter from Clarice's attorney arrived at Arthur's office. This was immediately followed by a court summons. She's going to file a personal restraining order to paint him as a monster in an attempt to force him to make huge concessions in the divorce settlement and gain control of the family property. Arthur looked at the complaint, full of lies, and for the first time a smile appeared on his face. An icy, quick smile with a hint of pleasure. He knew that his final audit was finally going to be the last step. The court of judgment is ready for his betrayers. Judge Friedman's stone-cold roar and the word FBI split Clarice's world of lies and ego like a bolt of lightning. Her mind went blank, her hands and feet went cold, and the eloquence that had once swept her through the social scene was now unable to utter a single word. She was roughly pulled from her seat by two tall bailiffs, and cold handcuffs were locked around her wrists with a click. The voice was crisp and decisive, like a final judgment on all her past choices. No, it's not true. She finally snapped out of her extreme shock and began to struggle frantically, her delicate hair falling out of her bun and her makeup washed away by tears and panic. You've got it all wrong. I don't know anything. It's him. He set me up. With her handcuffed hands, she pointed hysterically at the man in the dock who had been unusually calm since the beginning. Arthur, you asshole. What did you do to me? She screamed, her voice full of spite and disbelief. Arthur stood up slowly and straightened the lapel of his suit, as if he had just watched a play that was none of his business. He slowly walks up to Clarice, and the bailiff subconsciously holds her back in case she makes an overzealous move. It was the first time Arthur had looked at her squarely since walking into the courtroom. There was no joy of victory or pleasure of revenge in his eyes, only a kind of icy scrutiny, like a surgeon looking at a pathological slice. I didn't do anything, Clarice. His voice was not loud, but it carried clearly through the silent courtroom, each word carrying an undeniable weight. I'm just presenting what you've done, as it is. Every secret meeting you've had with Damien, every negotiation you've had in your attempts to embezzle our joint property, every account you've used to launder money out of the studio, and the complete plan for how you're going to kick me out of the business once you've got my money. Clarice's body trembled violently, as if she had been stripped naked and exposed to all eyes. How would you know? You forget my profession, Clarice. Arthur said lightly. I've been dealing with lies my whole life. And numbers, the natural enemy of all lies. You think your plan is seamless, but to me it looks like an audit report full of low-level errors and holes. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over Clarice's face, twisted with despair, and continued in that calm to cruel tone. Your greatest mistake was not betraying me, but the fact that you belittled me from start to finish. You treat me like a dull, boring fool who can be manipulated at will. You're so caught up in the flashy illusions Damien has woven for you that you don't realize that the very thing you despise and discard is the only reality you can rely on. When he finished, he stopped looking at her and turned to bow slightly to the judge. Your Honor, thank you for doing justice. I'm sure the FBI will get all the answers they need from Ms. Lombardi. As Clarice is forcibly removed from the courtroom by the bailiff, her eyes, once full of sparkle, are now nothing but dead despair. As she passed Attorney Sloan, the man who'd been so impassioned just moments before avoided her gaze like the plague at the moment. She knew that she was finished, was utterly and irrevocably destroyed. And the manipulator of it all was the man she had once been closest to and despised the most. The court fiasco is only the first page of Arthur's final audit report. The real reckoning has just begun. Clarice chose to cooperate with the FBI almost immediately after her arrest in an effort to gain leniency. She turned over the second set of ledgers, which had been hidden in an old computer, and gave full details of how she and Damien had used the shell company to launder money and how they had planned to commit investment fraud. She pushes all her ideas on Damien, portraying herself as an ignorant woman blinded and manipulated by love and vanity. With Clarice's testimony and the textbook perfect chain of evidence provided by Arthur, the FBI and tax authorities launched a thunderous joint investigation of Damien Vance and his company. Damien was in his penthouse luxury apartment at the time of his arrest, conferring with his attorney about filing for bankruptcy protection. Upon seeing the FBI agent who flashed his credentials, his always articulate face showed real fear for the first time. For the next few months, Chicago's business and social news pages were dominated by the Vance property scandal. Cutting corners, commercial fraud, money laundering, and bribery. Damien's business empire, as Arthur designed it, began from within and collapsed piece by piece, ultimately into a field of rubble. He was eventually sentenced to 20 years imprisonment and an astronomical fine, and all assets in his name were frozen and auctioned off to pay off his debts and compensate the victims. Clarice, on the other hand, received some relief as a tainted witness, but perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and money laundering still landed her a 5-year prison sentence. Her design studio, which she was so proud of, became infamous for being involved in a scandal and quickly went out of business. All property in her name, including those luxury items she had purchased with her illegal income, was also confiscated. Arthur's divorce proceedings from her went exceptionally well. The court awarded the vast majority of the couple's community property, based on Clarice's fraud and betrayal, to Arthur. The beautiful villa on the North Shore and the trust fund that had been skillfully isolated and protected by Arthur remained intact in his name. When the dust settles, Arthur's life seems to be back on track. He remains the same low-key, disciplined forensic accountant who commutes to work on time every day and handles complex cases. But everyone around him sensed that he had changed. The gentle, even somewhat dull shell of his body disappeared, replaced by a sharper, and also more confident, aura. He didn't sell the house that held so many memories. Instead, he brought in one of Chicago's top architectural designers, a pragmatist who truly rose to the top on talent, not hype, to completely redesign and remodel the entire house. All traces of Clarice's legacy, all that pompous furniture, curtains, and decorations that she had so carefully chosen, were thrown into the dump. The new style of the house is a minimalist, powerfully modern industrial. Exposed brick walls, metallic lines, subdued walnut furniture. Everything is well organized and full of rational beauty. This is the space that truly belongs to Arthur, calm, powerful, and inviolate. Nor did he leave Clarice's design studio to fend for itself. When the studio declared bankruptcy and liquidation, he anonymously acquired all of its assets, including that brand itself, for a fraction of the price, through a holding company. Instead of rerunning it, he did something that took everyone by surprise. He changed the brand name of the studio from Clarice Designs to The Ledger, which means ledger. He then offered the space to a nonprofit organization at no cost as an incubator to support talented young designers who lack the resources. This act earned him a great reputation. He has been praised for his generosity and vision, and for taking a tainted brand and rebranding it as a symbol of hope in a highly creative way. Arthur had gone through a number of channels to make sure that this reached Clarice, who was serving her sentence in prison, in the form of news reports and gossip among friends. He wanted her to know that everything she had betrayed and destroyed had been given a new lease of life at his hands, in a stronger, purer, more honorable way. She, on the other hand, was not only a failure in her own life, but a shameful and thoroughly erased footnote in his success story. It is a most complete denial. Deny her value, deny her taste, deny the whole point of her existence. 5 years later, Clarice was released from prison. In her 40s, she looked much older than she actually was. Prison life had worn away all her luster, leaving only a face of exhaustion and numbness. She was penniless and homeless, and the friends who once surrounded her had long since dispersed. She returned to Chicago, the city that buried all her glory and dreams. She arrived at the Ledger Design Center on a cold winter afternoon. She stood across the street, looking at the place that used to be hers. Today, the place has clear windows and is filled with the laughter and creative sparks of young people. The walls are alive with the bold and edgy work of up-and-coming designers. She saw Arthur come out of it. He was talking to a young designer with a gentle and encouraging smile on his face. The years seemed to have treated him exceptionally well. Not only did they not leave traces on his face, but they added a bit more of the charm and calmness of a mature man. Just then, a little boy of about 4 or 5 years old came running out of the center and jumped into Arthur's arms, calling out "Daddy" in a milky voice. Immediately afterward, a woman with a gentle demeanor, a professor who taught art history at the university and Arthur's later wife, also stepped forward. She naturally took Arthur's arm, and the three of them, as a family, made an incredibly harmonious and warm picture in the winter sun. Clarice stood on the chilly street corner, and watched the scene before her, her heart crushing hard as if by an invisible hand. She had thought that Arthur's life would be gray and crippled after losing her. But the reality is that his life, after she left, only really started to become complete and happy. Everything he had, a successful career, a beautiful family, a respected position in society, was all the things she had wanted to chase at all costs back then, but had ultimately missed out on. She finally understood completely and utterly. She lost, and she lost big. She lost not only her marriage and property, but her entire life. She turned silently, hunched over, and disappeared into the stream of people. No one knows her whereabouts anymore. Arthur came home that night. After the children had gone to bed, he went into his study. On the wall of the study hangs a huge picture of the city of Chicago at night, replacing a garish abstract painting that Clarice had hung there. He opened his computer and pulled up an encrypted file that he had permanently sealed. The name of the document is called Final Audit. It contained every step of his revenge plan, every detail, and the eventual end of each goal. He turned to the last page, which had only one line on it. The account is closed with a zero balance. He calmly moved his mouse, dragged the file into the recycle bin, and selected Delete permanently. For Arthur, that betrayal was like a bad debt that had to be settled. He did it in his most professional and chilled-out way. Now that the books have been closed, all the relevant vouchers should be completely destroyed. His life, long ago, turned over a new ledger. That page is filled with warmth, responsibility, and love. And all that badness from the past, let it be, forever, a string of irrelevant, completely erased code in the digital world. That's the end of today's story. For more captivating tales, hit subscribe and never miss an episode.